and we're excited to celebrate the achievements of our student researchers today during this session. So the plan for today is to start off with some brief housekeeping items. Then we'll share the work of our presenters in two separate sessions. So first, we'll show the first four presentations who are all discussing research on improving leadership and management in sports. And then we'll follow that with a quick Q&A. Then after that, we'll showcase the work of our next three presenters who are all discussing research pertaining to the leadership and management of technology and data. And then we'll follow that by a second Q&A session. So as far as housekeeping, we ask that everyone participate, right? So whether you're presenting or you're here as an audience member, please feel free to ask questions either during the presentations themselves or at the end. So if you have a question about a presentation, please put it like while the presentations are going on, please put that in the chat and then we'll respond to it during the Q&A. During the Q&A session itself, you can either raise your hand in your window or put a message in the chat. So whatever you prefer, if you want to ask it verbally, we really want this to be conversational and for everyone to feel comfortable sort of engaging with the researchers about their projects. So please keep your comments appropriate. Obviously, we're in a school setting, so don't say anything that you wouldn't say with your grandmother in the room. And then finally, we are recording. So we will, so please click that OK button so that you can proceed with the rest of the session. Also, we'll share links to the recording and presentation in an email that we'll send you in the next couple of days. So we'll have links available so that you can access this breakout session or either of the other two research presentation sessions. So if you had a friend in a different session, you'll get to see their work as well. Also, all of the presentations are being showcased on the ISSSSC's YouTube channel. And I can put the link in the chat in just a minute. All right, so moving right along to our first presenter, just to let you know, Alexandria Dribnock, the presenter of Women in Athletic Training, is not going to be here for the Q&A today, but if you do put your questions in the chat along with your email, I can pass them along to her when I see her next. So without further ado, let's watch the work of Alexandria Dribnock. Thanks, Leilani. And so now we turn to our last presentation of the first half, which is called The Impact of COVID-19 on Women Athletes and Women Leaders in the Sports Industry, brought to us by Joaquin Bueno. Great, thanks so much to Rocky and all of our student presenters in the first half. I'd like to welcome the presenters that we just saw to the spotlight. So if we could have everyone spotlighted to help, or just so that we can see who we're talking to in the Q&A. And then I'd just like to encourage the audience to go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question or just pop it in the chat. Sorry, I'm not sure. Amber, can you hear me? Could you please spotlight Joaquin Bueno, Leilani Sela, and Megan Green, just so that we can all kind of see who's participating in the Q&A?
Yes, I'm trying. They all don't have their screens on yet.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks so much to the audience for coming. And as we start thinking about questions, I've definitely got a lot of them, but I'd be happy to kick it off if, if the audience is still thinking. How about just as we're getting the videos to spotlight, how about, could you each tell me just a little bit about your inspirations for your projects? So if you could give us like a little background story, like 2 minutes or so, just kind of telling us what got you involved and passionate about the issues that you're discussing. Maybe we should go in the order of the presentation. So Megan, would you hop on first?
Yeah, so the inspiration for my kind of project is I've always been kind of passionate about bringing awareness to like assault, sexual abuse, domestic violence. It's definitely something that I see like going down in my career path. I'd love to be able to work for nonprofits one day. I'm also a member of the women's swimming and diving team. So this like case in particular really like hit close to home, like knowing that some of my former teammates were involved and that my coach was so involved in the situation. And it was just something that I wanted to look into more and be able to bring awareness for female athletes in the future, as well as just all athletes in general.
Great, thanks.
So I did a project last semester on adaptive sports, and mainly focusing on high school. And I found that there's a lot of trouble finding information on collegiate athletes for like adaptive sports. And I really wanted to dive into that and see like why we don't have that many sports for collegiate athletes. So I was thinking maybe it has to do with ADA, and I wanted to tie in COVID and how we could definitely like use that time that we had when there wasn't any sports and see like maybe that can make a difference and have more ADA sports on college campuses.
Okay, thanks. Rocky, how about you?
Hi, everyone. So as for me, I think I've always been passionate about sports and just the equity and equality part of it, especially with women and men's teams. We see it every day, and I think it's very important for us to talk about it and bring it to the surface as to how we can kind of like fix it or make it better for everybody, especially women in sports that are going to be in the careers or like, you know, in sports. So yeah, I think I've always just been very passionate about that.
Great, thanks. Again, please feel free if you have a question to either raise your hand or pop it in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions yet, so I'll go ahead and put mine out there. So maybe I'll start with Rocky first and we can go in the opposite order. But Rocky, I have a question for you. So you mentioned that a lot of different gender disparities that are occurring at different levels of collegiate and professional sports. From administrative and coaching representation to pay for professional players, and also pay for coaches and administrators as well, to the resources that are provided to men's versus women's teams. So how do you think these disparities are connected? Or in other words, can you tell us a little bit more about how you see the lack of women in leadership influencing things like athlete pay and the resources provided to female teams?
Best way I can answer that is I feel like the majority of the leadership roles are male dominated. So a lot of the times, any decision making that they do with like financial distributions or just the equality part of it, they give more towards men rather than women. There's not many representation of women in the higher leadership roles that can really have that decision making. So it's difficult to even think about distributing that to female athletes and administrators. I think there's a lack of imbalance also to like access that higher leadership role, just because it's majority of men that have that role.
Sure, yeah, I mean, and we could always come back and talk about some of the solutions for that, but we'll put that thought on hold, right? Like, how do we get more women in leadership? But keep as you think about that, let me turn to Megan and ask, you're a student athlete. So how much training did you personally receive about the therapy that you should expect when you go in the training room? And then sort of like second part of the question, besides trigger point therapy, what other topics would you like to see like new training for student athletes to cover?
Yeah, my experience as a student athlete, I actually went to another school before I went here, and at both schools, I actually had instances where trainers, like not anything like super inappropriate, but gave like incorrect therapy. Like I know at my college before, anytime anything hurt, they would just they're like, oh, put stem and ice on it, put stem and ice on it, just put stem and ice on it, and never actually went through any of the processes to rehab any of my injuries. And then when I was here at SJSU, I actually had someone crack. I have chronic migraines, and I had someone crack my neck. And just like cracking of necks is kind of something a chiropractor should do. It's not even something that an athletic trainer would have the training to do. And so it actually ended up hurting my neck because it got cracked incorrectly, and no one should have cracked my neck. And so, I think it's just really important to have trainings on almost anything that could possibly happen. Like, I think that ideally for me, I think what would make it the best is to have like a booklet, and it just has any kind of training in it. And so that way, before a trainer presents like, okay, so this is what you said is wrong, I think that you should have this kind of treatment done, they could open the booklet and there's a written explanation along with pictures or graphics that could be like, this is what I'm going to do, this is how it's going to go, and this is why I'm doing it. So you're telling me that your neck hurts, so this is why I'm going to manipulate your neck in this way, instead of just being like, okay, your neck hurts, let me do something without like telling you before.
Yeah, I like that idea about informed consent kind of, but in a training setting.
Yeah, because I think a lot of trainers just assume that you don't know, which is true. Like, if you're not a kinesiology major or you're not going down those kind of routes, you probably don't know a lot about different muscle groups. You probably don't know. I mean, I don't, and I've been an athlete my whole life. And so I think it's just really being upfront and very transparent with people, so that way you don't end up with discrepancies where people are like, I didn't want that done, and now it was done. Like, it doesn't even have to be something that goes along the lines of what happened with Scott Shaw, which is obviously like very severe and like sexual abuse. It could just be, I wouldn't have asked you to do that, and I should have been informed of what was happening.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And Leilani, I have a question for you as well. So you gave us this incredibly powerful example of a light switch being one of the ADA compliance standards that's changed between the 1991 version and the 2010 version of the ADA. Can you give us other examples of how a sports facility's failure to meet the new 2010 standards could make it harder for adaptive sports athletes to fully participate? Because remember, just for the audience too, I think, remember, athletes need to use the training room. They need to use the conference rooms. They need to use the whole facility, not just the playing field. So I think you raise a really good point. Could you just give us a couple more examples of things that have changed?
Of course. So you could even think about, before even getting into a stadium, think about the parking lot. Is there handicap parking available? Is there ramps to get into the stadium? So it's even something like that. They could change the height of a step. And you may not think it's a big difference to you, but it is a big difference for others. And it's even just, is there any ramps to get to my seat? Are there any ramps to get to the locker room? Any of that. And those are all changes in the 2010 ADA. And that's something like a little ramp. You wouldn't think that's a big difference, but it is. And elevators. So a lot of elevators, they always say they're broken, or they may seem like they're really run down. And if you personally wouldn't trust going in there, think about all the people who have no option to use that elevator. So those are just a few examples. There's definitely a lot more. And a lot of the times we don't realize what we take for granted. And it could be literally anything. There's so many changes. But I definitely encourage a lot of people to look into that and see how many that you could point out just from going to any sports stadium or even your college campus.
Thanks so much. We have a question from Brandon in the chat. And so this will actually go out to each of you in turn. And so maybe I'll start with Megan this time, and then Rocky, and then Leilani. And then we'll transfer to our next set of presenters. But the question is, what was the most interesting finding or piece of information from your research that you'd like to highlight for us? So any facts, events, or history that you learned of that really stood out to you? So Megan, could you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, I think the best thing that I found out through my research is actually while I was working on the project. Like I said in the thing, they did create a conclusion for the CSU investigation, and Scott Shaw, as well as the school, was found guilty of misconduct. And I do think that is obviously the best start, is admitting that you did something wrong and that there was something that happened in the situation that is wrong. And then also that the university is putting into place these new policies. I think they're very long overdue. And I definitely think that it is a win that we are going to have these new procedures in place to hopefully prevent anything like this from happening again. And obviously, like, they should have been in place the first time, and none of this should have happened. It shouldn't have drug out 10 years. But I think it's very exciting and comforting to know that they finally are taking steps in the right direction to have justice for all of those girls, as well as just protect their future athletes.
Yeah, thanks. That is a really important piece of information right there. Rocky, how about you? What was the most interesting thing that you've learned?
One of the things I'd like to highlight in my presentation is just how much work that they needed to do to change something. For example, the NCAA women's tournament, basically one of the players had to take a picture and tweet it out or send it to social media in order for them to even take a look at it or do changes for that. And I don't think it should have gone that far. And I think that basically, if you really want change, you just need to keep pushing for it. Also, the US soccer women's team, how their pay was very unequal to the men's. And so they would protest and like just write and fight for that. Like, I think just being able to do that and make changes is very important.
Yeah, I think thank you for shining a light on the amount of effort that goes in to affect social change. I think that's one of the dominant themes of this conference, is just that it takes a lot of work to stand up for human rights and social change, but it's definitely worth the effort. Thanks. Leilani, how about you? What was the most interesting piece of information that you came across?
Yeah, the most interesting piece of information I came across is the 1991 and the 2010 guidelines. I just think it's so crazy that you don't have to like update your facilities. And that's just like a 10-year gap of differences. And just going back to like the light switch and just thinking how if you put your arms up and try to reach a light switch from sitting down, just imagine like 6 inches higher. I just think it's super crazy that you don't have to change it. And there's loopholes, even though there's ADA, there's loopholes in everything. And that just really stood out to me because 1990s it's super different. And we're in like the 20s now. And yeah, I just thought it was a really big eye opener for me. And I honestly just learned that too. So I thought it was crazy.
Yeah. Thank you for calling that to our attention too, right? Like the fact that all these buildings are like complying with 30-year-old standards, and yet, so many people are struggling just for access to the facilities that we take for granted every day. Thanks so much. Let's transition to our second half of the presentation session. And in this segment, we will be talking about, or we'll be looking at presentations that are showcasing some of the infringements on human rights or the problems that are kind of occurring in the technology industry. So first up, we have a presentation by Cesar Gonzalez, Alfredo Ramirez, Christina Turnstall, and Brandon Chan, entitled A Facade, the Reality of Search Engines. All right, thank you so much to our presenters. For this segment of the Q&A, since there are 12 students, we won't spotlight them all because then it will be hard to even determine who's speaking. So I'll just ask the questions, and then if you want to be the one to respond, please just turn your video on, and that will signal to Amber that you are the person to be that will be responding. So I think I'll start off, since I don't see any questions in the chat yet. I'll just kick it off with the same question that we asked our first presenters initially. And that was simply, what got you interested in this topic? And why did you choose to focus on it for this conference? So I'll start with the first group that presented, and that was Cesar, Alfredo, Christina, and Brandon. If one of you guys could just kind of share some insights as to how you got interested in the topic of technology and privacy rights, we'd appreciate that.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I can answer that question. So for a class, we've mainly focused on technology rights. So we read, particularly we read algorithms of oppression. And so that kind of, not only this being part of our project, but that kind of fueled and reinforced our research. I was always interested in technology, just because it's always changing. It's just it seems like an aspect that's kind of unregulated at points. It's always changing, and I feel like that is a frontier on human rights, something new that human rights should tackle more, more better. But yeah, that is personally. I don't know if Brandon wants to add anything else.
Sure, yeah, we'll turn it over to Brandon.
So for me personally, I was really interested in more of the aspect of how you hear that phrase often. It's like, just Google it, and it's immediately everyone just kind of thinks and defaults Google to being really neutral and reliable, when in essence, there's actually a lot of hidden processes that are going on. And so for me, I was actually unfamiliar with this as well. And so to be able to personally do the research is really what got me into this, and just a personal interest for me, yeah.
Great, thanks. Anyone else from the first group want to chime in there? Okay, we'll turn it over to the second group. So Kate, Clelia, Jesse, and Loida Rosa. Could you share a little bit about your how your interests developed in this topic?
Yeah, so like previous group said, we were focusing on privacy rights and digital collection and data, all that in class. And I think what was really interesting for our topic is if you're not in tech companies, you don't really know what's being collected. It's not common knowledge what we are giving to companies or what they're taking from us. And then I just think it's underknown how valuable privacy is and how willing companies are to sell our data for profit to change us from the consumer to the product. So if anyone else has anything.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really important insight. I was kind of blown away seeing your presentation about all the different kinds of data that are collected. Yeah, Loida Rosa, go ahead.
Just to add on to what Clelia was saying, I think it's really alarming to learn about how companies are so ruthless in packaging and selling our data without us knowing. And I think it's really alarming too, because there's so many different modes that they're being collected. So for instance, through add-ons, browser add-ons, even antivirus programs, phone trackers, and our apps. I think it's really suspicious how the process isn't really necessarily transparent. And a lot of the times it's hidden in terms of services. So we don't really know what's going on unless we actually read through them, and they're actually really lengthy. So, yeah.
Sure, thank you so much. Anyone else from the second group that wants to chime in? Okay, then we'll turn to our third group. So Shada, Kiana, Shalitha, and Cindy. How did you guys get interested in this topic?
Hi, I'm Shada. So we got interested kind of similar to everybody else, just from the course and the algorithms of oppression book, but our presentation was unique since it showcased 5 specific companies. And we've gotten a little bit further in our research now, and we've done surveys and interviews with experts showed us these 5 companies, such a monopoly, and it's just been really interesting, and we're glad we could do it.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're cutting out there a little bit, Shada, so if you have anything else to add, please put it in the chat so that we can get your full thought there. But thanks so much. Yeah, I like the focus on the 5 companies because they do dominate technology, in a lot of senses, right? In terms of directing traffic and producing content and, making profits. So those are really important companies to focus on. Anyone else from the third group like to chime in? Okay, and then just a quick reminder to everyone in the audience, please go ahead and put your questions for these groups in the chat. since I'm still not seeing any yet, then I'm going to go ahead and just ask some of the questions that I have. And I think I'll stick with the same order of the presentations just because having large groups, I think it'll just make it a little more coherent. So talking to the first group, Cesar, Alfredo, Christina, and Brandon, you make a very important point that search engines are biased to favor the websites that pay them to increase their exposure. And this often leads to sites with misinformation getting more hits. You mentioned that Google does not conduct background checks on the groups promoting a page or review the content being published or promoted. And you also mentioned that there are culturally situated search engines like blackbirdhome.com and Jugal and jugottit.com, which are capable of eliminating stereotypes and discriminative suggestions. So I'm just really interested in this idea that these different search engines are, able to kind of overcome that algorithmic bias. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how they work. So are they using different algorithms altogether to determine which pages get displayed first? Or are they vetting the information on the sites that they return in the search? Like, how are they getting that done? So if you guys could shed a little bit of light on that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think I can present a little bit on that part. So there's this program that Google has for companies that would like to get on the advertising space, usually on the first page of results, and it's called Google AdWords or their AdSense program. And essentially, companies will kind of just market these links for Google to use, and that will kind of trace them back to these websites that they want more traffic to. In a sense, it's more so kind of directed at getting people to getting them closer to buying an actual product on, whoever is advertising or something. And these clicks are these links that they put up, you tend to get around a couple of cents to even $50 per click. And that's really all they're looking for. They're really just looking for clicks and engagements. And then, the profit comes from the consumer or whoever's interacting with the website as a byproduct or so.
Thanks. Yeah, Cesar, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I just say like compared to other search engines like DuckDuckGo, from what I've investigated, their main thing is not to collect your data, your personal data, because that's their main thing. Because they know that Google search collects your personal data, and that in turn is given to advertisers, and a lot of ads are based on whatever they collect. So their main concern is to not create and use your digital trace, which is basically whatever you're looking for, whatever things you're searching up. They don't trace that at all. So that's one of their main things that they have.
Yeah, that sounds like an important asset for sure. Yeah. Sorry, Christina, could you go ahead?
Can you guys hear me? Okay, well, personally, I liked Tor the most, even though it was slow. It was the privacy and how you can add it onto your whatever search engine. So I could just add it to Safari. I could add it to my Google, like just very convenient. Also, like blackbirdhome.com and You Got It, they were like focusing on that specific race or that specific religion or group of people. So it's kind of like a safe place for African American based search engine or like a Jewish search engine. So just the ranking of information and information was given was not as biased or discriminative as you will find on Google, where you have very conservative articles, you have liberal articles, and you know how Yahoo is more liberal, yet another different search engine is more conservative. So it just gave you a different option to look at it from a political scope more as a racial scope.
Sure. Thanks so much for that. I just want to stay up there for 1 second. Leilani has another question for your group. So she thanks you for all of your great presentations and admits that she's not super techie, but she's now going to think twice when it comes to picking a search engine or even just pressing accept to terms and conditions when, she doesn't read them, neither do I, right? Like there's just so much information and it's like information overload, right? But could you guys please repeat which search engines you recommend? Like which ones are less likely to steal your data, or
I would use.
I guess with your permission, but without really giving you an alternative?
I personally started using DuckDuckGo now, and I use Tor. I also did some research on Brave, which is another one. Those are the three ones that I personally use now. But yeah, I don't know. I know.
DuckDuckGo. Sorry, I'm typing them in the chat. Is that correct? DuckDuckGo,
Yeah.
and then you said Tor.com.
TOR, yeah, and Brave, like BRAVE. I know Caesar also used one of them too as well.
Yeah, I use Startpage is another search engine that you can use as well. Tor as well. I've since researching everything, I've stopped using a lot of like the browsers, so I've switched to Tor. I'm starting using non-commercial search engines. So yeah, Startpage is one. DuckDuckGo. Brandon, do you have any other ones?
Personally, I've been using DuckDuckGo and Tor like you two mentioned. To be honest, I kind of branched away from Google myself as well.
Great, thanks so much. I think that's super helpful. And then let's turn to a question for the second group. So for Kay, Clelia, Jessia, and Loida Rosa, I find the idea of deep fakes really fascinating. And you guys did such a great job of explaining how deep fakes of users who have really large followings can be dangerous. Like, for example, you mentioned falsified political videos, the dissemination of false information, and the undermining of public trust in news information. But it seems like deep fakes of ordinary people could be dangerous as well. Could you tell us some of the nefarious ways that deep fakes might be used of regular people, and what some of the potential complications of that could be?
Yeah, so first thing that comes to mind is like news stories of like, like scandalous, like pedestrian videos of like fake kidnappings, or like, different pedestrians just like walking on the street, just doing like, I guess, minor crimes. There are some examples of like deep fakes being used in those scenarios to kind of scandalize something that isn't real. And I feel like it can definitely cause harm for regular people, just because it can just cause panic and fear that doesn't necessarily exist. And I feel like right as of now, like deepfakes aren't used heavily just because the technology isn't as advanced. But I feel like in the future, it's going to be a problem for sure, because it has so much potential to be dangerous. Like, as I mentioned, like falsifying political videos or disseminating false information that can be really harmful. And even today, like we see a lot of problems as it relates to misinformation online. And I feel like with the presence of deepfakes, it'll be even harder to have a better distinguished understanding of what's real and what's fake.
Yeah, great point. So what about identity theft? So like, I just have to put that out there. I mean, you mentioned that it's not quite to that point yet, but is that something that you worry about in the future?
Yeah, I definitely feel like identity theft is going to be a really big issue in the future. That's also personally why like learning about data and technology has been so illuminating, just because I feel like we give up our privacy so much that it's very easy for us to fall vulnerable to like identity threats. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Great. Does anybody else from group 2 want to chime in there? Okay, thanks so much. And then a question for group 3, which is Shada, Kiana, Shalitha, and Cindy. You noted several of the steps that are being taken by tech companies to restore user trust after the Cambridge Analytica scandal and other data breaches. One that you mentioned was joining consortiums like the Partnership on AI or the Information and Industry Council. It sounds to me, at least, like these steps taken are mainly symbolic. That is, they appear committed user privacy. Sorry, it makes the tech industries or tech companies appear committed to user privacy, but because these organizations don't have the authority to maintain any oversight or enforce the rules that would be necessary to protect privacy, they're not really effective at creating social change. So do you think that that is actually the case, or are any of the tech companies following the suggestions that you laid out to really move the needle on safeguarding privacy?
I can take this one if my internet is working better. So yeah, that's mainly the issue with the consortiums, is that there's no enforcement power. They're just more like how the UN operates, where there's no kind of enforcement, and it's just mainly recommendations that they can put. So that's mainly where government regulation comes in. And yeah, so that's where we had opted for government regulation and for companies to have limits on how much data they can take, or even if they should take it at all.
Sure. So you see this like it as being the government's role to kind of step in and regulate that.
That was one solution in our paper, although we explored a few different solutions. That was one of the main ones.
Sure, absolutely. And then so to kind of piggyback on that, you mentioned that Facebook, Amazon, Apple, IBM, and Google have been kind of, committing these infringements on privacy. But are there any tech companies that you think are doing a good job at protecting user privacy?
So our paper only mainly explored those 5, and we didn't really explore too much of other tech companies. But out of these 5, we weren't impressed with the steps they've been taking. So that's why a big portion of our paper was about regulation and solution for these 5 companies.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a limited scope for the project, but I think just pointing out some of the infractions that are being committed by those 5 is super important. And thanks so much for that insight. Yeah, so we are at the end of our time here today. So thank you so much to all the groups who presented. We will be putting a link in the chat so that you can return to the main session, which will begin at very shortly.